All right, I think we can get started at this point. So, hi everyone. My name is Greta Zaro. I'm the organizing director with World Beyond War, and I'll be helping with today's webinar. This is a webinar with Paul Atwood titled "War Has Always Been the American Way of Life. Now Where Are We Heading?" Co-sponsored by the Florida chapter of World Beyond War and also the Veterans for Peace chapter 136 in the Villages, Florida. And before we get started, a few Zoom logistics. Today's event will run for about 1 hour, and we are recording the event. So if you have to leave at any time, no worries. We will send out the recording afterwards, and we'll post it to the World Beyond War YouTube channel. And please use the chat box throughout the event to post your comments and questions. We will get to those at the end. If you haven't yet, feel free to use that chat box as well to introduce yourself and say where you're calling in from. And we do have closed captions enabled for today's event. If you would like to view the captions, you can click on the CC Live Transcript button, which is usually at the bottom of your Zoom screen, to enable the captions. If you don't see that button, sometimes you have to click the 3 dots in the bottom right corner to find the captions. And a reminder that the captions are done by robots, so please excuse any errors with the transcription. And with that, I will pass it over to Larry Gilbert, who is a coordinator for the World Beyond War Florida chapter, who is helping to organize today's event. So Larry, please go ahead.
Thank you, Greta, and good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Paul Atwood, who served in the U.S. Marine Corps, where his opposition to war emerged. He joined Vietnam Veterans Against the War as soon as he learned of its existence. In 1985, he was one of the founders of the Boston chapter of Veterans for Peace, the Major General Smedley D. Butler Brigade. And Smedley Butler is one who said that war is a racket. And so he earned his, Paul earned his PhD at Boston University with Howard Zinn. He is author of War and Empire, The American Way of Life, 2010, London, Pluto Press. And he edited Sticks and Stones, Living with Uncertain Wars. He has published numerous articles and has written frequently for the online magazine of Counterpunch. Now retired, he taught at the University of Massachusetts, Boston for more than 30 years and is still teaches courses on U.S. foreign policy and was also a principal founder of the William Joyner Center for the study of war and social consequences at UMass Boston. The center was named after a veteran who succumbed at a young age to the poison of Agent Orange. So without any further ado, Paul, take it away.
Well, thank you, Greta and Larry, and to all you out there who have taken the time to come and listen to what I have to say. I appreciate that. I want to begin with a quote from the German philosopher Hegel, that the only thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. And I'm sure many of us sitting here today have thought that ourselves many times. War has always been the American way of life. To the extent that most Americans know anything about our wars, their grasp of its centuries-long history is confined to lifelong propaganda that all of our wars are the fault of enemies or the other, to which our government responds in the interests of all of us. The cold hard facts are that America's wars have always been wars of choice. So I want to begin briefly with America's very first war and then turn to the mythologies and legends that surround the war against Japan. I do that mainly because my father was a Marine who fought in that war, was wounded, and carried his PTSD to his grave. So let's begin with the simple fact that the United States began as one of the first outposts of British imperialism. We want to believe that a desire for religious freedom inspired our origins, but take note of the fact that the Puritans denied such freedom to the natives, and and subsequently drove them to near extinction. Also omitted usually is that the Plymouth colony was funded by a joint stock company in London. That is to say, one of the early antecedents of the modern corporation. So the Puritans had the obligation of shipping commodities like lumber, fur, fish, etc., back to London for the purposes of profit for that joint stock company. So religious freedom has always taken precedence when explaining this, but it's not as simple as that. So the first war in North America began in the colony of Massachusetts, which is named after the language of the tribe living there at the time. Only that name, the name of that language remains. Everyone knows of the original Thanksgiving, but largely ignore the fact that the generosity of the native chieftain Massasoit enabled them to survive that first bitter winter. But within a generation or so, so many Puritans had arrived that they vastly outnumbered the natives. They began to enclose collective property and to restrict the natives from lands they thought were theirs. So by 1675, only 2 generations after Plymouth, the predominantly Puritan colonists numbered 65,000, while the Wampanoags had been extremely reduced by new disease epidemics brought to these shores by Europeans. So given the total population of both sides, King Philip's War, as it is known, produced the greatest casualties per capita of all other American wars. And that's why I begin with it. Of course, the natives suffered the greater proportion. King Philip's Regional High School is located in Wrentham, Massachusetts. Public school. I met a few graduates of that school who do not know why it has such an odd name. I'm sure most citizens have never heard of this war. The sachem of the indigenous resistance was Metacomet, the son of the very Massasoit who saved the Pilgrims during their first winter, who had taken the name of King Philip as a gesture of friendliness to initial colonists. To this day, the very title of King Philip's Regional High School celebrates the first bloody victory over indigenous Americans. Metacomet was beheaded. His head remained impaled upon a post for 20 years in the town of Plymouth. His body was cut into quarters and his limbs also hung on trees. His wife and child were then sold into slavery, as were thousands of his fellow native tribesmen, people. When are we going to introduce these facts into our Thanksgiving celebrations? Of course, matters did not end there. Such atrocities against indigenous tribes continued for almost the next 2 centuries, right into the early 1920s. And they've continued against many other peoples too. So I always ask my students if they can name the last time American soldiers fought a foreign enemy on American soil, and very few can do so. Of course, the first and only foreign enemies against whom the nation US waged war on its territory were the British. The last time in 1815. Later wars against Mexico and Spain were effectively propagandized as the provocations of those nations, but these were lies. The real aim of the American rulers of the time was identical to that of the British, to take their territories and to profit from that, not because they had aggressed against the United States, but to increase American economic and strategic power. By 1848, the US was poised to become a Pacific power. In short order, the US would enter the rapidly accelerating international competitions that would produce World War I and World War II. And as I speak, circumstances are ever more ripe for round 3. We know that our recent wars in Vietnam and Iraq and many others have been based on lies, deceptions, and omissions. So why do so many believe that this does not apply to the current war in Ukraine? Or, for that matter, World War II? Most Americans have no idea what really led up to war with Japan, nor do they know that the attack on Pearl Harbor was no surprise to American officials. Let me ask you if you have ever heard of Millard Fillmore. He was the 13th president of the United States, who served from 1850 and 1853, and he initiated an almost century-long process that ultimately set in motion war between the United States and Japan. In 1852, Fillmore dispatched Commodore Matthew Perry to open Japan to American trade. By that time, the British had initiated the Opium War in China as a means of weakening that state and then seizing Shanghai and Hong Kong as first stages of a larger conquest. Simultaneously, in the United States, an industrial revolution was fully underway in building steam. Investment in banking capitalism was gaining more power. American bankers and industrialists perceived that Europeans had entered the larger Great China market by force. They ardently wished to follow suit and saw Japan as a first step. The US viewed Japan as a backward, primitive society ripe for exploitation, but the real target was China, and Japan's ports could expedite the goal. In 1852, Perry sailed what the Japanese still called the Black Ships into Edo Harbor, today Tokyo, and demanded a meeting with the highest officials. Japanese were alarmed and refused. He then threatened force, shooting some cannon bursts onto a small, uninhabited island in order to impress the power of the American Navy's modern cannon. At that stage, Japanese society and its armed forces might be compared to late medieval England. Japan's shogun thereupon capitulated and agreed to the inception of relations between the two nations and American use of Japanese ports, so to venture further into Asia. The successful Perry then counseled that Congress take measures to secure bases in the Pacific, the most strategic being Hawaii and the Philippines, which the US subsequently seized by the end of the century. But the US had promised the native Filipinos independence from Spain, but instead recolonized them for American strategic interest aimed at further encroachment into Asia. The Philippine War paralleled the future war in Vietnam. Now the Japanese perceived the degree to which the Europeans were inserting themselves throughout Asia. They saw that the British were in India, the French in Indochina, the Dutch in what is now Indonesia. Given their weakness, they had solid reason to believe that they were next. The result was a complete transformation, top to bottom, of Japanese society and especially its military. The new rulers of a reconstituted imperial system now reasoned that to avoid the fate of other Asians, they would have to become and act like the Europeans and Americans who threatened them. And by the turn of the 20th century, the Japanese had mastered Western-style military tactics, defeated Tsarist Russia, taking parts of Siberia, occupied some of China, adopted and adapted capitalism, and then began plans to strengthen themselves by accessing resources, labor, and markets from other peoples in Asia, just as the Westerners were doing. They had become competitors in the great game of power, as the British dubbed it. I think many of you may know of Zbigniew Brzezinski, and I mention him because he wrote a book called The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and its Geostrategic Imperatives. Brzezinski was the guy who gave the Soviet Union its Vietnam in Afghanistan. And by the late 1990s, he was among the very few foreign policy elites calling for all-out global American dominance. And he helped to inspire the military to call for full spectrum dominance. In 1899, the Japanese imperial system was collapsing, and Europeans, Japanese, and Americans rushed to control various areas of China. The US sent troops to crush this rebellion. Known as the Boxer Rebellion, the young Chinese students were rebelling against takeover of parts of China by foreigners. They were known as the Society of Righteous Harmonious Fists, hence the Boxers. Few of my students entering university from high school have ever heard of this, nor have most Americans. But we can be certain that the Chinese have not forgotten this bloody episode. It was part of what they call the long century of humiliation. If Chinese had ever invaded the US, our children would learn that on the first day of the first grade. In that same year, the US issued the Open Door Notes, arguing against the carve-up of China in favor of open Western access to its riches on equal terms for each and all. The US believed it had every advantage since it was the most rapidly growing economy in the world. Let me state categorically that while the term is rarely used today, the open door policy continues to be the overarching and bedrock goal of American foreign policy. When Washington speaks of the rules-based international order today, it means that the world's resources, labor power, and markets must be open to American corporate enterprise on American terms, a global capitalist system beneficial primarily to American investors and those nations and their elites that cooperate with the American agenda. The United States will go to war to ensure this policy, and it has demonstrated so time and again across the planet since 1899 to the present. Westerners lost the footholds they had in China when they began to slaughter themselves in World War I, thus leaving the path fully open to Japan. Believing that its only defense against Western predation was to become a predator itself, Japan moved to dominate its part of the Pacific and East Asia in the same way the US controlled much of the Western Hemisphere. But that would close the United States out. The Great Depression had reduced American economic production to a standstill. American oligarchs still controlled the nation's wealth, but the majority of its citizens still suffered deeply, and the political system was rocked to its roots. American capitalist production had to find new outlets since American consumption had all but evaporated. Millions were unemployed, the nation was divided, and dangerous instability loomed, far greater than that of today. Enormous obstacles to the export of US goods and capital had taken shape. The communism practiced by the USSR already stymied new outlets in Eastern Europe, and then the takeover of Central Europe by Nazi Germany closed much of the continent. Meanwhile, Japan was ruthlessly taking over much of China and East Asia. Thus, the US was economically isolated. All but the Western Hemisphere was closed to American trade and investment, and even their depression limited trade. Solution? In words spoken by the CEO of the General Electric Corporation, permanent production for permanent war. 16 million unemployed would soon fill the ranks of the US military. My point here is that Japan's subsequent takeover of Korea, Manchuria, and Vietnam provided the real rationale for the Pacific War, not the attack on Hawaii. That was merely the spark. Japan was obstructing, perhaps permanently, the American goal to access the riches of China. Why have I been going on about this? Because that is the reason the US opposed the USSR later domination so much of Eastern Europe. And not because it was tyrannical and abused human rights. Recall that America abuses human rights all the time. It was founded on such abuse. Rather, communism, and this applied later to Chinese communism as well, obstructed the overarching goal of American foreign policy. In no case did either pose a threat to the United States militarily, that is, until the nuclear age. And that, in both cases, was a response to American nukes. Prior to outright war in 1941, the US had cultivated what came to be known as the nationalists in China, and it was arming this client secretly And American pilots were carrying out attacks on Japanese forces as they waged war in China. All of this in outright violation of congressional law stipulating that America was to remain neutral. The United States was being anything but neutral. It was secretly fighting in this war. Sound familiar? Obviously, Japan saw this as a precursor to full-scale war with the US. In 1938, President Roosevelt moved the US Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Pearl Harbor, built up naval force in the Philippines within striking distance of Japan, later cut off all oil and steel necessary to Japan's overall economy and its effort to subdue China, and demanded full withdrawal from Southeast Asia, or else, in the words of the State Department. Fully cognizant of American naval superiority, Japan knew that it must strike first and deliver a blow to the American Navy and give itself more time to build defenses. The target could only be Pearl Harbor. Both sides had seen Pearl Harbor as the logical initiation point of a Pacific War. December 7, 1941 was no sneak attack. The Japanese hoped it would be, but Washington and London had broken key Japanese radio transmission codes and knew that the Japanese government had taken the decision for war and that its fleet was moving toward Pearl Harbor. This has been proven by research, but you will never hear that we were listening to Japanese as they planned for war, for the sneak attack, for the so-called sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. High-tech espionage tools of the day, known as radio direction finders, tracked the fleet across the Pacific. The Roosevelt administration was fully aware that the American public, sick at the loss of American life during World War I, and aware of the corruption of the arms brokers or merchants of death, wanted no war. But Washington reasoned that if they could push the Japanese to attack first, the public would be outraged and war would necessarily ensue. Thus, even though they knew that the Japanese were embarked and heading towards Pearl Harbor, no warnings were given to commanders in Hawaii. The 2,400 Americans killed that day were pawns in the giant and deadly chess game that continues to this day, with the extreme possibility of being the end game. My father was wounded as a Marine in savage and ruthless fighting in the Pacific. As I said, the PTSD of which he carried to his grave. Let me briefly say something about the savagery of the actual combat that is always omitted. The American inhumanity, that is. Though the Japanese were equally atrocious, because war is by its very nature barbarism. During the war, Life magazine, the most popular in the country, published a photo of a Japanese head, its mouth open in an obvious scream, mounted on an American Marine tank. Another issue depicted a full-page photo of a well-dressed professional woman staring at a Japanese skull atop her desk that was sent home to her as a souvenir by her beau. Paul Fussell, a World War II veteran himself, a noted student of war literature, published an article called On Japanese Skulls, which was illustrated by photos of Marines who had surrounded their encampment with skulls on stakes. All of these images can still be accessed, although for the most part, they've been systematically buried. I have long hoped that my father did not participate in these gruesome atrocities, but I know he was aware of them. He could not have been otherwise. So gruesome and all-encompassing was the organized murder of the war in the Pacific. So with that, where are we headed today? First, how many Americans know that the US attempted to overthrow the Soviet government of Ukraine as far back as 1949? The newly established CIA recruited numbers of Ukrainians who had sided with the Nazis during the European War and to actually kill more Jews than the Nazis did. It was an absurd attempt to separate Ukraine from the Soviet Union and failed ludicrously. This seems ironic since the Nazis could never have been defeated in the first place without the Soviets. In fact, the USSR was a de facto ally of the United States in that war. But it didn't remain that way for long. Let me say that Russia and then the USSR has never demonstrated any threat to Western Europe. The last time Russian troops were in the West was in 1815 after contributing to the defeat of Napoleon, who had invaded Russia the same way that Hitler later assaulted Russia. At the close of the European War, Russia occupied much of Eastern Europe, its traditional sphere. It occupied these territories and East Germany because many of these countries had allied with the Nazis, including Ukrainians. The Russian occupation of Europe and Germany was agreed by all victors at numerous conferences. Nevertheless, almost as soon as war in Europe ended, Washington announced that the USSR was the new threat to global peace and security. Keep in mind that Russia had suffered upwards of 30 million dead, all of its major cities leveled, its railroads, its roads gone. Russia was in no position to attack the West, even if it wanted to. And make no mistake, the CIA knew this. But again, recall why Washington opposed Russian communism. Not because of Stalin's dictatorship. We've supported so many of them, we can't count them. But this was useful propaganda to inflame public opinion at home. The real reason was that communism anywhere obstructed the fundamental goal of American capitalism. We know that the Soviets, Stalin posed no military threat to the US and would not until he developed nuclear weapons. And that was because the US had employed them against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The military director of the Trinity program of the atomic bomb actually said that the bomb was developed with Russia in mind, not with Japan. First Germany, but then when they learned that the Germans were failing to build the atomic bomb, they began to focus on Russia. Japan was known to be on the verge of surrender as intercepted coded transmissions, again, proved beyond doubt, and that the atomic weapons were not necessary to its defeat. The weapons were employed to send a message to Russia, and Russia got the message. It got its own acquisition of nukes from fear of the US, made Russia's system even more invulnerable to the penetration that had long been an aim of the American elite. Russia took control of Eastern Europe because it wanted a cordon sanitaire, an armed territorial security guarantee that no hostile enemy would ever again threaten or invade Russia, as had the Nazis. That is why it does not want NATO on its doorstep today. Yes, it inflicted dictatorship and privation on Eastern Europe, but when has the US cared about such matters in relation to victims of its own? American rhetoric about human rights is hypocrisy of the first magnitude and is employed only as Orwellian deception and duplicity. The threat of NATO so near to its borders has always deeply troubled Russia, and the subsequent dishonorable betrayal of the first Bush promise not to advance 1 inch eastward toward Russia has accelerated to the emergency from the perspective of today's Russian government. Russia will no more accept NATO on its doorstep than the US would accept another Cuban Missile Crisis. Anyone who believes otherwise has succumbed to delusion or psychopathy. Russia is not going to back down from its occupation of the Donbass and Crimea. These territories were once actually part of Russia itself, are populated by many Russians, and Crimea has a Russian majority. These territories were given over to Ukraine by Lenin and Khrushchev. For centuries, they were integral regions of Russia. As far back as 2008, US and UN and NATO US and NATO asserted that Ukraine would enter the alliance in time. Meanwhile, the CIA was constantly at work to destabilize the wishes of many Ukrainians to keep ties with Russia. In 2014, the CIA, with help from huge sums of money, American neocons like Victoria Nuland, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and presidential aspirant John McCain, stirred up violent riots, resulting in the ouster of the elected government of Viktor Yanukovych, pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych, who fled for his life. The subsequent government of Ukraine was all but handpicked by Washington. Citizens of Crimea and Donbass were alarmed by the overthrow of the government that a majority of the citizens of Crimea and the Donbass had elected. The majority there voted for Yanukovych. They declared autonomy, not independence, but autonomy. In the chaos that followed, the governments of Germany, France, Russia, and Ukraine worked out a compromise known as the Minsk Agreements that recognized this autonomy, while also asserting that the two provinces were still part of Ukraine. Meanwhile, the CIA and Ukraine's government organized real neo-Nazis and regular Ukrainian troops to begin waging real war in these regions. This war continued for 7 years without an invasion by Putin, with the deaths of 14,000 Ukrainians of both Russian and Ukrainian descent. Today, the media all but ignore this. Consider that Putin did not wage war against Ukraine during all that time, that 7 years, despite these costs, until he had enough and re-annexed Crimea and Donbass. It was only when he feared that Ukraine was about to launch its own invasion of Eastern Europe in February of last year that full-scale war ensued. In April of last year, negotiations between Russia and Ukraine were initiated by both sides, only to be prevented by the US and the British. There was a chance. The Russians are not going to back down, and the avowal by the US and NATO to wage the current war to victory is reckless insanity of the first order and has no resolution other than the Armageddon Biden so casually and nonchalantly warned against last year, unless a negotiated settlement can be found. We are headed for that Armageddon unless a way is found to wake up the American people to the looming, ominous, and increasing probability of our self-extinction, either by nuclear annihilation or climate desolation, or perhaps even a merger of both. Somehow, the American public must be made aware of reality and demand an end to these foreboding cataclysms. Negotiation, compromise, and international cooperation are the only possibilities. In the words of Martin Luther King a half-century ago, quote, "There is such a thing as being too late." Hope I haven't used up too much time. So I'm open to whatever.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. Yes, so we have about, actually, pretty good. We have about 20 minutes or so for Q&A. So we invite everyone to put your questions and comments and feedback in the chat box, and I will read those off to Paul. And while we're waiting for those to come in, Larry, do you have any initial questions or responses for Paul?
What an interesting history lesson that I hadn't heard before and hadn't really studied. Boy, American exceptionalism.
Yeah.
I'm a Vietnam War veteran, and had I known then what I know now, I would have been a conscientious objector. And so, I think that it's a war mentality that we have, and it is always, when you look right down to the root, it's always about money. money and power. And unfortunately, it's young people who go and die. And as a colonel from the Vietnamese army once said, in every war, it matters not who won or lost, the people always lose. And certainly from this history lesson, that's exactly what has happened over the centuries.
Just to bring back Brzezinski again, the title of his book is The Grand Chessboard. From the perspective of those who make, the moves on this geopolitical game, they never think about, or if they do, they don't care about the pawns in this game. And those pawns are the soldiers who fight these stupid wars, psychopathic wars, and the civilian victims.
His son is the American ambassador to Poland, as a matter of fact.
I'm sorry, his son is?
Yes.
His son is, huh? And his daughter is on MSNBC in the morning.
Morning Joe.
Yeah. Where he treats her like she's the rag doll. Yeah, he interrupts her all the time and doesn't give her a chance to finish sentences.
Sort of like Chris Matthews used to do. Do we have any questions?
We do have a few questions coming in. The first from Diana, who says, Canada is lockstep with American foreign policy, and people in Canada are as brainwashed as they are about how evil Russia is and how great the West is. Any suggestions about what we can do here in Canada to promote peace? And before I turn it over to you, Paul, I'll just very briefly say that World Beyond War has a big presence in Canada. We have a Canadian organizer, Rachel Small. So Diana, if you're not in touch with Rachel, I will put Rachel's email in the chat, and I can also put a link in the chat to show you what we're doing in Canada. We have a lot of different campaigns going on, but yeah, Paul, love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I wish I had a magic answer for you. All I can say is that if you're now involved in trying to educate people as to realities, to keep doing it and not to give up. I know that doesn't sound like very much, but that's really all we can do at this point. I remember when the Vietnam War protests broke out, they came out of the blue. They were organized mainly by young people and to another extent by religious figures. And it seemed that their numbers were so tiny, but eventually they were able to bring out hundreds of thousands of citizens against the Vietnam War. I wish I had a magic answer for you. I get that all the time. But don't give up.
Step by step, day by day, that's what we all try to do. We have another question coming in from Cody. What do we do when both major parties, I'm assuming this means the major political parties in the US, seem in lockstep with the current foreign policy prerogatives of endless wars? At least when I was a kid, there was a vocal anti-Iraq war contingent.
I'm sorry, could I hear that again?
Oh, yeah. Basically, Cody's question is about what do we do when both of the major political parties, both Democrats and Republicans, are both very pro-war? Yeah, there doesn't seem to be any anti-war contingent anymore.
Again, you're asking me for the magic solution. If I knew, I would tell you. I do what I do. I still belong to Veterans for Peace and with Massachusetts Peace Action. And we're demonstrating all the time about one issue or another related to our wars, and I just keep going. I encounter all kinds of people who don't want to hear what I have to say, or a lot of what we have to say. But if we don't at least try with all of our might to do what we can, I can predict the future, and it's not a future we want. And for many reasons, not just the threat of nuclear war, but for me, that's the most important.
And that's a good segue to the question that just came in from Will, who says, do you believe that if Putin thinks he is going down, would he use tactical nuclear weapons? And would the US and NATO respond in kind? Would it possibly escalate to the point of thermonuclear war?
Well, that's the real danger. I can't read Putin's mind. I don't know what he would do if he thought it was going down. But I think that if he did use a nuke, and certainly if it caused damage in NATO territory, the US would be likely to respond similarly. And then it would escalate from there. I always tell my students, and they don't like hearing it, that as long as these nuclear weapons exist, sooner or later they will be used, sooner or later. And once that happens, it's out of the bottle. And it's fundamentally insane that we've allowed this nuclear weapons to continue to exist since that day. Right after World War II, there was real hope that they could be contained at the very least. And instead, an arms race began almost immediately.
I guess I would love to hear from you, Paul, sort of your work with the students, and how do they respond? A lot of us are there's a classic sort of cliche like statement of, how do we get more young people involved? And also another thing is, how can we get anti-war education into schools? So I'd love to hear about how you have gotten this message into universities.
Well, I began my teaching career at UMass Boston while I was getting my PhD, and I was a director of the Joyner Center, the Center for the Study of War and Social Consequences. So all of my courses were from the very beginning devoted to the study of war, whether it was World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, the Middle East wars. My favorite course is called U.S. Foreign Policy since 1898, because that's when the United States leapt upon the stage of world competition and very quickly rose to the top of that competition, at least for a while. It's not there now, or it's certainly losing ground at the present. But the students who take that course seem genuinely interested in learning, mainly because of the current crisis. Most of them today, the students I have today, were born around the time of 9/11, but they don't really know much about it. But they do kind of want to know more about it, but they're really more concerned about the current crisis. I guess they were listening to Biden when he warned us about Armageddon. He should be doing more than warning. He should be doing what a president of the United States should do to prevent that all-out catastrophe. But of course, that's not what they're doing. They're feeding the monster. I can't say that all students feel, and I've been, of course, I've been accused of being a communist sympathizer and all that, but that goes with the territory, right? So I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Sorry, Larry, go ahead.
Yeah. So you served in Vietnam, did you?
Oh, I did not.
Oh, so well, after your military service, how did you then decide to become a member of Veterans for Peace and such?
Well, it's a long story.
I'll take the shortened version.
When I first went in the Marine Corps, I was very gung-ho. I was only 17 years old. I had drunk the Kool-Aid, and I believed that the United States was exceptional and everything else. But as we were training for Vietnam, I was a grunt, and I was training for Vietnam. All kinds of things began to happen. Probably the most important was that I began to openly question what we were doing in Vietnam. And for that, I was told to shut up. And I didn't shut up. And one night, 5 guys from my unit ganged up on me and then put me in the hospital. They told me that I had been told to shut up, and this is the punishment. I had a dislocated jaw, a concussion, and I spent 2 days in the hospital as a result. My esprit de corps suffered a real hit at that point. And ultimately I went AWOL and ultimately wound up in jail, the brig, and had a really interesting escape from a court-martial. I told you that I grew up in Roxbury, where my grandfather had grown up as well, and where the then Speaker of the House, John McCormick, had grown up too, and they knew each other as childhood friends. So when I was locked up, my grandfather and my mother went to visit the Speaker of the House, and he pulled strings to get me released without going to Vietnam. Prior to that, I had been offered an escape from the court-martial by agreeing to accept orders to go to Vietnam, but I refused. And that's when they really started to throw the book at me. But my representative, John McCormick, the Speaker of the House, pulled strings to get me out of the brig and an honorable discharge. And I felt that I had been extremely blessed and so highly privileged to, where there's so many others who were in my situation too, who suddenly realized that they were being, sent to the fields of war crime, and they didn't have the escape route that I was so fortunate to get, and so I felt that I had an obligation to join. When I first saw Veterans for Peace marching in a New York parade, I immediately stepped in with them. And,
oh, great. So, yeah, as a matter of fact, the film, The Boys Who Said No, I think are now streaming online. So
that's an excellent movie.
Yes.
That's an excellent movie.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, one of the boys who said no lives here in Maine. So
Wonderful. We have a few more questions coming in we can try to get to.
sure.
One question is, have you had any pushback from the university administrations for teaching these important non-traditional classes?
No, an interesting story about how the Center for the Study of War and Social Consequences began. UMass Boston, alone of all the Boston area colleges and universities, had the largest population of student veterans, largely because tuition free and all of that, and because many of the veterans, weren't going to go to Harvard or BU or any of that. So, well over 100, 150 maybe veterans stood up in the campus center in formation beneath the chancellor's office, demanding that he institute this new Center for the Study of War and Social Consequences, which we would begin teaching what we saw as the real story behind American wars. And the university has never opposed us in any way, and they actually funded us for 30 years or so. But then about 10 years ago, they began to withdraw the funding. And from my perspective, the center today is an empty shell because it has no real funding. It still technically exists, but I don't know what it does anymore.
Do you know what sparked that change of heart?
Not exactly. One of the reasons that the reason that the university wanted to the university funded us is because they were getting pressured from legislators downtown. Legislators in those days were mostly veterans. They were mostly male, and they were mostly veterans either of World War II or Korea. And I had spoken with a number of them down there, including the president of the Senate at that time, and so had many others, other my colleagues. They told the university to fund this center and that they would give us money. And they insisted that we get a budget that was free of the university, that the university could not raid our budget. And that remained the case for many years, as I said, until we began to be defunded and finally told that we had to raise all of our own money from now on. And that proved to be very, very difficult. It wasn't difficult in the early years. People, all kinds of people and foundations were interested in the Vietnam War, which is what we were focused on, at least at first.
Mhm.
So,
Okay, we have a few more questions coming in on sort of miscellaneous topics, so this is going to jump around a little bit, but there was a question about the Nord Stream pipeline and if you have any theories about that situation.
well, again, I always go back to the fact
About
that,
money.
huh?
Money.
Yeah, well, the United States, espouses the open door policy. But again, we don't use that term anymore. We want a rules-based international order in which the US makes all the rules. And its ultimate goal is to profit from the resources, the labor, and the markets wherever it can. And that means to force others to our will. There was a real problem with Germany getting all of its gas from the Russians, cheap gas from the Russians. So blowing up the pipeline, which was really an act of a criminal act of war, has forced Germany to depend now on much more expensive natural gas that is being shipped from the United States to Germany. So money was a big part of it. And it also sent a message to Putin, we're willing to escalate right up to what point? To what point are we going to escalate? And it's extremely dangerous, extremely dangerous. And for the person who asked the question about how do you make progress on the war front these days, is you've got to, because the alternative is unacceptable. We've got to.
Joe is a Vietnam veteran and visited the Soviet Union, and there was an exchange where Soviet soldiers were telling stories about their experience in Afghanistan, and US soldiers were telling stories about Vietnam and how their situations are quite similar in those two scenarios. And Joe says, I knew what would happen in Afghanistan when the US invaded in 2001, yet why did that war last 20 years?
What war last 20 years?
The Afghanistan war when the US invaded.
Why? Well, for geostrategic reasons. If they could gain control of Afghanistan, initially in the late 1990s, the CIA and the governor of Texas at the time, Bush, were secretly meeting with members of the Taliban. And in order to convince them to allow pipelines to flow into the Indian Ocean. And the Taliban refused. And so that's when the United States really began to escalate its war on the Taliban. And the Taliban were willing to allow Osama bin Laden inside Afghanistan for a while, but he subsequently moved to Pakistan. And of course, the United States always insisted that Osama bin Laden and the Taliban were allied in order to wage terror upon the United States. But the real reasons is that the US wanted the strategic positioning in that region. Again, to surround, Brzezinski's The Grand Chessboard insists that the key to global domination is command of Eurasia. And that is a fool's errand if ever there was one, because certainly Russia and China and India and many others are not going to allow themselves to be dominated by, these are civilizations that go back thousands of years. And here we are, this adolescent bully boy on the corner, seeking to dominate It's just, it's fundamentally insane from my perspective.
All right, final question of the evening, Paul, and I should say before I ask this question, that World Beyond War does not take a position on political candidates, but I will ask you, Paul. So the question is, how do you feel about the candidacy of Robert Kennedy Jr., whose position on the issue of Russia and Ukraine sounds similar to yours?
Yeah, I see that too, but, I have trouble with his position on Israel. I have trouble with, I think that his voice needs to be heard on the issues of war in Ukraine, but I couldn't support him. I could support Cornel West, I believe. I've never voted for a Democrat, nor have I ever voted for a Republican. I always have voted for a third party of one kind or another. In fact, the very first time I voted for a communist who somehow got on to the ballot. I'm not a communist. I think the communists, at least the communist regimes, have largely betrayed the original ideas. And China is not really communist today. As a capitalist nation, it poses a far greater threat than it did when it tried to practice, its form of communism. I don't know, did I go off track or?
No, thank you very much, Paul. I'll pass it off to Larry to close us out.
Well, Paul, I certainly want to thank you very much. I think we held on to the audience that was here from the very beginning, and that is because of the interesting presentation that you provided to us. I learned a lot from you. I agree with you, and I certainly applaud you as a fellow member of Veterans for Peace. And I want to thank you for agreeing to do the presentation here this evening. And thank you, and offer you my very best wishes, and let's pray for peace.
Thanks to all. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night, and we will send out the recording in the next day or so.
Thanks
Thank
again.
you, Greta, as well.
Bye-bye.
Bye.